I wanted to start by saying I'm so grateful to Dimitri and Vlad for inviting me. I think it's a big privilege to be here because, in my view, civic peace building is really about courage and integrity. And that's really what I'm going to talk about, because that's the way we deal with wars in our time. And what Vlad and Dimitri asked me to introduce some of the concepts that I have developed for thinking about these issues, human security and new wars. And I don't know why, it says confirm your speaking language suddenly. I can't, I hope it'll just disappear. Sorry. So they asked me to talk about these concepts. And I thought that the best way to talk to you about them was to tell you about my own experience and how these concepts were developed. So that's what I'm going to do in this brief time. In the 1980s, I was a peace activist. The United States and Britain and other countries had just agreed to a new generation of nuclear weapons to be deployed in Europe, and I was against it. And I joined a part of the peace movement that came to the conclusion that the best way to get rid of nuclear weapons would be to end the Cold War. So our goal was to end the Cold War, and we thought the way to do that was to join up with the opposition in Eastern Europe. And so off we all went to Eastern Europe, and we met all sorts of amazing people like Adam Michnik and Václav Havel and George Conrad. And for me, it was a hugely important moment in my intellectual formation. The argument that these people had was that communism survives because of complicity with the regime. That's why it survives. And Václav Havel, some of you may be aware of it, he wrote an essay called The Power of the Powerless, in which he used the example of a grocer who puts on the outside of his grocer's shop, "Workers of the world unite." And he doesn't believe in it for a moment, but he puts it on the outside of his shop as a way of saying, don't give me any trouble, I'm a loyal citizen. And Havel's argument, and the argument of people around him, was, well, actually, we have to refuse these kinds of lies. That's the only way we bring about change. And they developed all kinds of concepts like civil society, like anti-politics, like the parallel polis. And the idea behind all these concepts was creating independent space in society where people can talk to each other and discuss openly and honestly. Civil society was a term we'd actually never heard very much. It was something Hegel and Marx used, but it wasn't in everyday language like it is now. And of course, what they meant by civil society is not exactly what people mean by civil society now, because now people tend to mean NGOs and independent groups, whereas actually it meant something much closer to civic, which is why I'm very glad you're using the term civic peace building. It was about doing things in the public interest. It was about acting as a citizen, as a free and independent citizen. And so their argument was, if we create more and more space in society, we'll change the relationship between the state and society. And at first, when we had this dialogue with them, there was a lot of suspicion. They thought that peace activists must be sort of sympathetic to the Soviet Union, because it was the Soviet Union that kept talking about the need for peace and going on about the arms race. And certainly within the peace movement, there were also suspicions that human rights activists were just tools of Western governments. And what happened as a consequence of that dialogue was that we really overcame those suspicions and came to a conclusion by the end of the decade that peace and human rights go together. That actually, the way to understand the Cold War was a kind of mutual enterprise between the United States and the Soviet Union. It was the threat of the West was always an argument for suppressing dissidents. And the threat of the Soviet Union was always an argument for marginalizing the peace movement. And by coming together, we overcame that argument. We showed that we in the peace movement were genuinely against nuclear weapons, but we were also against the Soviet Union and for human rights. And also we came to the conclusion that actually in situations of peace, there's more space for human rights. And actually, peace can only be achieved if there is human rights. So that coming together of peace and human rights is what I would call human security. I'll come back to what human security is, but I think that was the beginning of the argument. And I should say, before I go on to the next period of my life, that of course, all this had been anticipated by the Helsinki Agreement of 1975. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that agreement, but it involved all the countries of Europe and North America, from Vladivostok to Vancouver. And it was after the Vietnam War, and it was the price, in a way, that the Soviet Union was willing to pay for détente. And so it had three baskets. One was security, that was the peace basket. That was territorial status quo, which is what the Soviet Union wanted. The second was economic and social cooperation, which the Soviet Union also wanted. And the third was human rights, which the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries signed up to because they never thought it was serious. And actually, those three baskets are human security. And the peace movement and the human rights groups came out of that agreement. We couldn't believe there was going to be another Cold War, another arms race in the 1980s after the Helsinki Agreement had been signed. And so I think what was really important was that the Helsinki Agreement actually represented a basis on which peace groups and human rights groups could campaign. So in the aftermath of 1989, many of us hoped that there would be a pan-European security system based on the principles of Helsinki. And to be sure, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe was established, but it was fairly marginal. And from 2000, both the United States and Russia began to arm again. So we had ended the Cold War, but we hadn't ended the arms race. After 1989, some of us decided that we wanted to maintain the dialogue. We wanted to do something else with it. And that's when we established the organization called the Helsinki Citizens Assembly, which some of you, I know Dimitri, know about. And the idea of the Helsinki Citizens Assembly, which was launched in Prague by Václav Havel, was that we were going to create a pan-European civil society. We were going to help civil society in difficult places, just as we'd done in the 1980s. We were going to bring peace and human rights together. And almost as soon as we had established the Helsinki Citizens Assembly, wars broke out in the Balkans and in the South Caucasus. And we had local Helsinki Citizens Assembly groups in all these areas. And it was through visiting these local groups and transmitting their demands to the European Union or to our governments that led me to the second concept I'm going to talk about, the idea of new wars. Because what struck me when I visited these places was that they didn't look like how I imagined war to look like. They didn't look like the sort of World War II movies that we'd all seen. You know, there were people in homemade uniforms. There were refugees milling about. It was just very chaotic, actually. And so thinking about it all, I started to think about how this was a new type of war that was different from the old wars that we have in our heads, which was really born out of the experience of World War II, although I'm not actually sure that even World War II completely conformed to that vision. And let me just say some of the differences, and then I want to say something about how the logic is different. So, first of all, there were different actors. In old wars, the actors were the regular uniformed armed forces of states. In the new wars, there were criminal gangs, warlords, paramilitaries, and also a sprinkling of regular forces, organized in sort of separate armed groups. That was the first difference. The second difference was that they were all about ethnic nationalism. And the wars of the past, I thought, were either about geopolitics, you know, winning a land advantage or a sea advantage, or about ideologies like fascism, socialism. But these were about ethnic nationalism. And what was really striking was that ethnic nationalism was being constructed before our very eyes. I mean, one of the things that struck me so much, both in the South Caucasus and the Balkans, is that people would say to you, I really don't understand why this war has happened. We all went to school together. We don't hate each other. So how did we suddenly start to hate each other? I mean, the Western interpretation was that these were ancient rivalries that were suppressed by totalitarianism and bubbled up after the end of the Cold War, but it wasn't like that. And actually, people were taught to hate each other, because if you're going to be killed because you're an Armenian or an Azeri, or because you're a Serb or a Muslim, then you do start to hate the other. And so it was actually the construction of ethnic nationalism that it was all about. And then a third factor was that the tactics were different. So old wars had battles in fields where soldiers confronted each other. And we do have that, of course, on the Ukrainian-Russian border. But that's not very usual. Actually, most of the violence we see in new wars is violence directly against civilians. And the goal is usually political control of territory rather than military control. And you gain political control by expelling everybody who doesn't agree with you. And usually that's the other ethnicity. So ethnic cleansing was a feature of both the Balkans and the South Caucasus. And it was linked, I'm afraid to say, to the introduction of elections. And all kinds of horrible tactics. I mean, the aim was, it wasn't a consequence, forced displacement. Forced displacement was the aim. And I think, honestly, the tactics look very similar if you look at Israel in Gaza today, even though Israel is saying its goal is the defeat of Hamas. You can argue maybe that you have to get rid of all the civilians in order to defeat Hamas, but it looks like very much similar to the kind of tactics that were being used to, whether it's systematic rape, sexual violence, whether it's looting, whether it's the destruction of cultural heritage. These were all designed to produce forced displacement. And then finally, the last characteristic was about money. These wars were happening in places where taxation had fallen off, and the consequence of neoliberal policies. There was no money to fund the weapons, and so they were using criminal sources. They were using violence to fund the war. They were looting, they were taking hostages, they were charging money at checkpoints, they were smuggling, they were getting involved in all, they were stealing humanitarian aid. these were all the kind of characteristics of the new war economy. So these were the ways in which they seemed different. But after a while, I realized that the differences weren't simply an empirical difference. It was actually a conceptual difference. It was a difference in logic. And that's something that I've become more interested in, and I think is really important for us to understand. So old wars were about winning or losing. And, you know, the great theorist of old wars was Clausewitz, who said wars tend to the extreme as each side tries to win. But actually, these wars increasingly were not about winning or losing. They were about the gains you make from violence, either the construction of ethnic nationalism, political gains, or economic gains. And if you start realizing that, you realize these wars don't necessarily tend to the extreme. They tend to persistence. They're very, very difficult to end because nobody has an interest in ending them. And you might have top-down peace agreements, as you did in Ukraine in 2014, as you did in Bosnia, but they only work if you kind of entrench the warlords and the ethnic militias that actually continue their predatory activity, so that post-agreement is not so different. There's a permanent war-peace situation, which is the case still in Bosnia and still in the South Caucasus. Really, the goal is a kind of chaos. The other thing I learned from these new wars was thinking about what's the alternative. In these wars, the alternative isn't to bring in troops and defeat one side or the other. It is a sort of humanitarian intervention, and many of the ideas that came out of the HCA groups. For instance, safe havens, the idea that you try to protect civilians against the warlords, the idea that you try to create a space where people are not afraid and therefore don't have to be ethnic nationalists of one side or the other, where they can talk and act in a civic way. The idea of war crimes was an incredibly important idea, the idea that this is really about the rule of law. These wars are intrinsically illegal. They're not only illegal in terms of the laws of war, which is about international humanitarian law, but they're massive violations of human rights. So thinking about the law is really important. I'm not going to go in at length about all the possible ways out, but I just, at the end, I started summarizing it in the same way as I talked about the end of the Cold War in terms of human security. At the time, I talked about cosmopolitan law enforcement, the idea that bringing together human rights and international humanitarian law and developing a human rights basis for law is a kind of, some philosophers are calling it cosmopolitan law. And then I decided it sounded too intellectual. So I used the term human security, and thinking about this kind, one thing I would add here, that in this situation, human security is very different from national security, which is about defending you against an enemy. Human security is about reducing war and trying to increase the observance of human rights. It doesn't mean necessarily that you don't use the military. You might need to defend people from genocide, for example, and use the military to defend them from genocide or to defend them from invasion, as in Ukraine. But the key thing is that if you then do use the military, you do it on completely different principles. The aim of using the military is not to defeat the enemy. The aim is to save civilians. And what that means is that while there may be occasions when it's permitted to kill an enemy, it's only if it's necessary to protect civilians, which is very, very different from international humanitarian law. We have this very odd disconnect, which I think you see at the moment in Gaza, that somehow it's okay to kill if it's called a war. That's why it was so important for Netanyahu to say this was an act. This was an act of aggression by a foreign state, rather than this was a crime against humanity. And if he'd taken the second line, he could have gone to the Security Council. He could have chased Hamas to arrest them, but it wouldn't have been called a war. And you couldn't have engaged in this kind of killing spree, which for those who accept war, accept somehow. I'm over and over again sort of astonished at the way people accept deaths in war in a way that they wouldn't in normal times. So, but we can talk about that later. So that's the second thing, human security. I have forgot to look at the time, so I won't go on for very much longer, but I just thought I should come back to the wars we're facing now, to talk about Ukraine and Gaza. And how does this kind of analysis apply? Well, in my view, Putin has been fighting new wars since he came to power. And his aim in those wars is not necessarily winning or control of territory, it's chaos, long-term permanent chaos, which is his justification for his own legitimacy, for his own power. So he started with Chechnya, then Georgia, then Syria, then Ukraine. And I think winning is irrelevant. What is really important is that as long as the chaos exists, it's an argument for mobilizing people, or at least obtaining their complicity. And I think you could argue that Netanyahu is very, very similar, that he relies for his power on being seen as the person who defends Israel, and he actually needs chaos around him. And of course, in the situation we're living in, there's a very high risk that both will succeed, that we will see the kind of long-term persistent wars that we're seeing in other areas. That I think Dimitri was saying one way I often use to discuss new wars is to describe them as a social condition, that the warlords, the gangs, the continual criminal activities and the ideological activities have to be continually reproduced. And so it's sort of like a communism or a capitalism. It's a sort of social condition. And in a way, part of the prognosis is, will this lead to this long-term social condition and possibly its spread? And in the case of Ukraine, of course, Ukraine is very different. Ukraine is a democracy. It's actually fighting to win. It wants to liberate its territories. But I think there's a huge risk that the longer the war goes on, the more it will become like a new war, the more it will mobilize anti-Russian feeling, the more people will turn to looting for a method of survival. The more they'll use their weapons for criminal activities. It's very hard at the moment. The civil society response has been absolutely amazing, but how long can that be sustained? And unless you see sort of changes in the way the Ukrainian government responds to civil society, it's going to be very difficult for them to sustain this war without it sort of disintegrating in the way that I describe. And I think this is also the case with Israel. I think both Netanyahu and Hamas have an interest in just a continuing war. And the tragedy about what Netanyahu is doing is that far from defeating Hamas, I think it will mobilize people in support. I mean, when the war began, Palestinians were very unhappy with Hamas. But now the prisoners who've been released from jail, the terrible things that have happened, has mobilized support for Hamas. So it's really alarming to think what could happen. So how do I end up with some kind of alternative, which I hope we can discuss in this group? I think the alternative is very similar to what it was in the Cold War. It is all about refusing complicity with the regime, whether you're in Israel or whether you're in Russia. I think many of the dissidents in the 90s became dissidents not because in Eastern Europe, not because they thought they would change anything, but because they wanted to live according to their consciences. And then, as somebody said, I can't remember who, strangely enough, it did have consequences. They started linking up with each other, supporting each other, and eventually they became civic groups and they became civil society, and those civil society spaces multiplied, often as a consequence of the links with the peace movement, which had made it more difficult for the regimes to crack down on them. So I think that thinking about this and thinking about human security and thinking, I mean, key to that whole discussion of civil society is the idea of human security in the sense that we're thinking about the rights of both Ukrainians and Russians and not just Ukraine or Russia. And we're thinking about the rights of both Israelis and Palestinians and not Israel and Palestine. And, you know, when we talk about Israel and Palestine, the horrors that were inflicted by Hamas are just as horrible as the horrors that, or maybe we won't even compare them, but we have to feel appalled both by the horrors inflicted by Hamas and by the horrors inflicted by Israel. We can't be one-sided in this situation. And so I think what we need to produce, so developing civic spaces in a way, both wars will only change through political change inside Russia and inside Israel, and probably inside Palestine as well. And thinking about that, that seems terribly optimistic, but at the same time, I also think sort of creating civil society spaces, having transnational conversations of the kind that we're having here are sort of the key component of refusing this type of complicity. So anyway, I'll end there and we can talk about all this.
Okay, yeah, thank you so much. I think there are a number of questions in the chat. And
I haven't looked at them.
To ask for people to ask more questions if there are some, but maybe I can read out the ones that are already there.
Yeah.
I guess.
And I'll just briefly remind that you can write your questions both in Russian and in English, and we're going to translate them to English if they're in Russian. And maybe after we go through some of the questions in the chat, we'll also have time for some of you to raise your hand and ask your question directly, so that we'll have that kind of live communication as well.
I guess there is a question on the difference between the old wars and the new wars, and the very concept of the new wars. And Natalia asked if you can provide some clarification on that. Was it different from the wars that were in the Roman Empire, or the ones between the British Empire and the Opium Wars in China? What's the difference?
Well, the difference, as I say, is a difference of logic. Actually, when I originally wrote my book on new wars, I saw old wars as the European wars of the 19th and 20th century. And I was drawing a contrast between those wars which were between states with these new type of wars. Now, I'm sure there were many wars in the early modern period in Europe. I think colonial wars were a little bit different, actually, partly because the Europeans were using their technological technological superiority to win. They weren't trying to create chaos. They were trying to win. But I think the key to my difference between new and old wars is about the logic. Is it about trying to gain something from the other side? It could be military control of territory. It could be a sea lane. It could be, but clearly in the Second World War, the Allies were trying to defeat fascism. That was the goal. And once they defeated fascism, it was finished. In these wars, of course, there are goals, the political control of territory, but actually they need constantly to keep the wars going, to sustain the political ideology which they've established and to sustain their economic sources of revenue. And so I keep trying to say the difference between the two types is actually a difference of logic. And I've no doubt there were wars of this kind in the past. So maybe the word new is not a very good word. But I rejected all other words because they didn't quite work. The other thing about the newness is that I think there was something new that happened after the end of the Cold War. Because a lot of people say these new wars are civil wars in contrast to the international wars of the past. But actually the civil wars of the 60s and 70s were really contests. They were contests, they were about anti-colonialism, anti-authoritarianism, and that's very different from the wars of the 80s and the 90s. And it involved very different people. I mean, one of the things I often say is that in the 60s and 70s, if you were a radical student, your dream was often to go to the hills and become a Marxist-Leninist guerrilla. If you were in the third world, you wanted to defeat capitalism and colonialism. And after 89, most radical students wanted to become civil society activists. They didn't want to become Marxist-Leninists anymore. And when you look, actually, I haven't talked about that at all. I realize I left out lots. But many of these new wars have been a response to democracy. So, they all start with civil society protests, whether you're talking about Ukraine, whether you're talking about Bosnia, whether you're talking about Syria. And it's a way in which those protests can be diverted into ethnic armed conflict, which is what happened. I mean, if you look at what happened in Bosnia, most of the people who were protesting for peace and democracy before the war began actually became, during the war, civil society. Many of them left the country, but they became human rights groups, they became humanitarian groups. And the people who actually joined the war were very often unemployed young men from the countryside who were mobilized for money by armed entrepreneurs of either side. And exactly the same thing happened in Syria. So the people who fought were not actually the same as the civil society groups. So what I'm really saying is the difference between new wars and old wars is a difference of logic. What about the Roman Empire? Which kind of wars did it lead? Well, I think similarly to the Opium Wars and colonialism, these were wars that were aimed at winning and pacification rather than wars aimed at permanent chaos. And that's the difference between both colonial wars and the classic international wars, which are what I refer to as old wars. I don't know if I've answered that question.
Yeah, but I mean, maybe it's a point of another discussion, maybe. But if we can move to another question that is asked in the chat in Russian, which is actually about how should a democratic state respond when it's being challenged by the militaristic groups of a new type. I mean, let's take Israel, for example, which is in a difficult situation, and I'm reading the question further on. How should it react when it was attacked by terrorist groups?
Well, I think I actually did say that, but I think in the case of Israel, as was the case with the US in 9/11, I think an attack by a terrorist group is not the same as a classic attack by another state. And it should be treated not as an act of aggression, but as a crime against humanity. And if you treat it as a crime against humanity, then yes, you have to deal with the terrorists. But going to war with the terrorists, which is what but the United States did after 2001 when it invaded Afghanistan and Iraq, and as Netanyahu is doing against Hamas, actually doesn't solve the problem. It actually ends up creating more terrorists. And so, in fact, by declaring it a crime against humanity, saying you're going to use intelligence and policing to try to deal with Hamas, first of all, Israel could have got a resolution in the Security Council. It could have had global support if it had said that. But secondly, it might have been a much more effective way of dealing with Hamas because, yes, they could have used special forces to go after Hamas. They could also have, drawn well, they have done that to take the cases to the International Criminal Court, but they could also be dealing with the sources of finance and get global support in doing that. They need support from Qatar and Iran. But this way, they've alienated all that kind of support, and it's extremely difficult to deal with Hamas. I found there was a wonderful quotation from Lawrence of Arabia, T. Lawrence, who some of you may have heard of, who said, using conventional military force against a terrorist is like eating soup with a fork. And I think that's a very good analogy.
There's another question about what power in the world may allow social activists to challenge those power holders of governments who actually tend to act as terrorists. So I guess the question is about how can activists actually achieve change and how can governments respond when it seems, I mean, if I may continue my thinking on this.
Yeah.
And I'm also, I might.
Yeah, sure. Go ahead, Vlad.
Yeah, just I wanted to add and to complement this question with the one that's been sent to us before the webinar. I guess it might go along. It seems that in many of the cases you mentioned that civic right activists and groups and civic society could act mostly after the conflict, well, the hot period of the conflict has ended on the reconciliation and dialogue and stuff like that. But then what is the role, and is there any role of the civic society and civic activists and during the conflict when it's active in the hot stage?
And let me throw another point into this. I mean,
But wait, there are three different questions. What was the first?
Okay. The first one was about the power holders.
Yeah.
I guess we're talking about the governments who tend to respond with repression or with terrorist acts to those who challenge them, to the social activists who challenge those power
holders. And then the second one was civil society during war. Yeah.
Sorry, can I clarify my question?
Sure, go ahead.
Just like governments act like terrorists, they are ready to kill their own people and their neighbors, and activists cannot do that. So how can those guys, being that good, challenge and win over those people, terrorists of the states, of governments?
So those two, is that you said there was a third, Dimitri?
Well, I mean, yeah, if I may, and thanks, Andrei, for clarification. It seems to me that in the logic, in the geopolitical logic of great powers fighting each other or states fighting over superiority, there is no real place for civil society that challenges those concepts. And it's no coincidence that civil society groups are among the first to be attacked during the time of war by governments on both sides of dividing lines. So it seems that when we're talking about the notion of civil society, we're not talking about national citizenship. We're talking about the notion of civicness, the notion of civility, and the notion that I think you mentioned a number of times in your work, the islands of civility, that some people have to care about the real security, not the security that is measured in the warheads, but the real security of how people get medical aid, how do people get educated, how people feel safe in the streets. Someone has to provide for that, even in the times of dire conflicts. And that type of civility, that type of islands of civility is something that makes civil society relevant at any point, but it also makes it, well, in a way, counteracting the whole narrative of the war, of militarism, of geopolitical struggles, and so on. And I don't know if I made my point clear, but...
Yeah, you've answered the question for me, but I will add to it. So on the question of power holders, there's a wonderful essay actually by Hannah Arendt about how power depends on legitimacy and not on violence. And I think that's right, that the extent to which power holders can get away with violence also depends on the ability of citizens to preserve their civic space. So it's a sort of two-way relationship. And I think nowadays, where we live in a much more globalized world, there actually is more possibilities opening up for civic space. Although, of course, there's also, we could think of some downsides in terms of surveillance and technology. But there is space opening up in relation to international organizations, in relation to other states. So very often those who create these islands of civility find they're able to link up internationally. And that's exactly what my story about the end of the Cold War was about. I think it was just, there was, the official peace committees in those days saw Western peace activists as their allies. So Western peace activists were constantly putting pressure on them to permit greater civic spaces, and were constantly publicizing what was happening. And I think that was really important. And we could discuss, is that a relevant example? But my point really is that civic spaces are not necessarily purely national, they're transnational. And the degree that you have civic spaces, the more you have civic spaces, the more you can limit violence. So that's the first question. On war, absolutely civil society goes on during the war. And I think, Dimitri, thanks. I mean, I increasingly talk about it as civicness. But actually, all those groups that were active in democracy before the war become humanitarian groups. They do local mediation. They document war crimes. They're the first responders. And actually, society would not survive in these conflicts if it weren't for a degree of civicness. And civicness isn't just civil society group, it's doctors who will treat patients, whatever their ethnicities. It's teachers who will continue to teach children civic values. There's so civicness is pervasive in war zones. And the question is, how can you use civicness to reverse this sort of social condition? Is civicness a way in which, something on which violence depends? The armed groups can think, oh, well, it's okay, these civil society groups, or how can they challenge the power holders? I think there is an element in which they can. And I, again, actually, interestingly enough, think international links are quite important. The international community tend to think civil society is a really nice concept, we'll give them money, but they don't actually realize they're the source of knowledge, they're the only opportunity for ending the war. And once they were, if they could come to that realization and you could transform those relationships, that would make a huge difference. And that's where I come to Dimitri's last point about geopolitics. Of course, that's really difficult in a geopolitical world. But we don't live, I think, entirely in a geopolitical world. I mean, I think after the end of the Cold War, we saw the growth of the UN, we saw the establishment of the International Criminal Court, we saw the establishment of the European Union, which, even though it keeps saying it wants to be a geopolitical actor, is really not. And it really operates, external policy is based on human security. And so there are other actors in the world other than geopolitics. And that's why these transnational connections are so incredibly important.
Well, I see actually a lot more questions coming up, and we'd have to decide how do we want to deal with it. Maybe take 2 more, and then maybe some of those questions can go into the breakout rooms. And Mary was kind enough to actually stay with us for the whole time, so there'll be a chance to discuss it also in the breakout rooms.
Let me say one question I noticed. Money has always been linked. I completely agree that money's always been linked to war, but the difference between old wars and new wars is that the money was controlled by the state and the military forces were financed by the state. Now it is that the money is controlled by the armed groups and they directly find their sources of revenue. And so it becomes an incentive for them to go on fighting because the violence is a way to make money.
Okay. Okay, so there's a question about the Ukrainian war, and I think that's the one that we cannot bypass. Is it a new phenomenon for you as a researcher?
What does it say?
Is this current Ukrainian war a new phenomenon for you as a researcher? Has it brought a substantial shift to your theoretical view of new wars? Because for many people, it was a great conceptual shock. People dying of sepsis in the trenches for the first time since World War II. It's the war that has been very heavily documented at the same time. What do you think about all of this?
Well, I do think Ukraine is different, although I think the Russian side is not so different. Even though what Putin did on February the 22nd was an old-fashioned conventional invasion, which I think was probably a consequence of his own hubris, that he thought he could win a conventional war by invading Ukraine. And I mean, I remember at the time, the Ukrainians didn't believe he was going to do it. I didn't believe he was going to do it because I thought there would be a Ukrainian resistance because wars are very difficult to win nowadays. But it's not so difficult to keep wars going and creating chaos. And I would say that much of the Russian side is not so different from what they did in Chechnya. In fact, lots of the techniques of bombing civilians and hospitals were taken from Syria. So it wasn't, but actually the Ukrainian side is different. It's neither an old war or a new war, and I don't quite know how to express it. I mean, what is extraordinary about the Ukrainian side has been the mobilization of civil society in support of the war. And, you know, nothing would have succeeded without civil society providing both social support and indeed direct military support. So in some ways, you could say Ukraine was carrying out a classic self-defense policy that was that is typical of an old war, that it was responding to an act of aggression in an old war way. And in some senses, that's true, but there are also all sorts of new characteristics. I mean, it's much more international. Ukraine is very, very dependent on external support. Old wars were mobilizing and self-sufficient, and Ukraine's very different in that respect, and the role of civil society is very different. So I think something different is happening in Ukraine, and indeed you might argue that with the documentation of war crimes, with the role of civil society, maybe Ukraine is offering us an example of how to deal with a new war. But there's also the risk that I talked about, that it could, if the war keeps on going and if the Ukrainian response doesn't work, then it could disintegrate into a new war. So I think Ukraine is something new, a new war, if you like. But I think thinking about the analysis of new wars and thinking about the typical way that Putin has behaved and the way he combines, which is very, very typical of new wars, sort of oligarchy and ethnic nationalism. It's quite useful as a way of thinking about the Russian side. And it's interesting to think, is Ukraine offering something very new?
Okay, so I think there are quite a number of questions. And if I may suggest, and if you agree to that, maybe we can forward those questions. We translate them into English and forward it to you. If you have the time to respond to some of them later on, that'd be an option. Maybe some of them would be a point of discussion among us as well. But I do want to ask the one about how do you see the future? Do you see a world without wars? Because there seems to be an opposition between that and a thesis that wars will always be with us because it's part of the human nature. There is a hope among us as peace activists, as civil society activists, that there is a possibility of a world without war, but in reality, the number of wars keeps on growing. So it's impossible to kill all the good people, all the bad people, and to have all the good people remaining. So, but what do you see as a possible scenario for the future? And I may add from myself, where do you see kind of causes and reasons for optimism in advancement of the security and so on?
I mean, the first point to make is that wars can't be won any longer. That's the lesson that we've learned from Russia invading Ukraine. It's the lesson we should have learned from all the US interventions in the post-war world, from Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, Afghanistan. The sort of old-fashioned winning of wars militarily really isn't possible, because actually there's become a kind of equalization of technology that, you know, an insurgent with an improvised explosive device can be very effective against an American tank. A Houthi with a drone can be very effective against an American warship in the Red Sea. And so what that means is that wars either lead to long-term attrition, which seems to be what we're seeing in Ukraine and Russia, if they don't escalate, or as we saw between Iran and Iraq many years ago, or if they escalate, they risk human extinction, which means that old wars are really impossible nowadays. But what is possible is the spread of this new war as a social condition. And that's what we're seeing in parts of Africa, in parts of the Middle East, in parts of Central Asia. So the question is, to Dimitri's question, is there an alternative? I think there's been enormous progress that we're not really even aware of over the last few decades. We've seen a huge increase in international law and regulation at an international level, often to do with economics, to do with commercial, but actually everybody is incredibly interconnected now. And there's a growing and much more thick international regulatory framework. You know, as we in Britain discovered after Brexit, the idea that we were somehow free to set our own standards, most trade agreements are about standards, turned out to be a complete myth. So we're hugely interconnected, but also these regulations and these interconnections aren't just in the economic and commercial sphere. I mean, human rights has become much, much more prominent than it ever was before, since the mid-70s. We have had the establishment of the International Criminal Court. I think the public responses, both to the wars in Ukraine and to the war in Gaza, show there is a growing sentiment for peace that is very different from the sentiment of our politicians. And also, I think the huge emphasis on international law, whether we're talking about Ukraine, which is the most documented war in history, or we're talking about what happened in Israel. There's a growing emphasis on international law. The International Criminal Court has come to be seen as more important, despite the fact that, you know, people criticize it for double standards because they didn't indict Bush and Blair for invading Iraq, but they have just indicted Putin. So I think what we are seeing is and you know, the European Union itself is an extraordinary peaceful experiment. So if we're looking for positive signs, I think there's a growing public sentiment that war is actually an anachronism. One of my students gave me a poster which said, "War is so last century." And I think it is an anachronism. And I think people are increasingly thinking in human rights terms. And the question is whether that civil society, human rights way of thinking can offset this depressing trend towards the growth of war as a social condition.
Okay.